speaking from personal experience, people get into really bad relationships when they're children. And this can hurt them in a way that is long-term and a way that is irreversible. Our case is simple. First, obviously, we are not going to tell them that you should never be in a relationship, because that would mean me saying, my fucking wife is annoying, or my husband is annoying, I made a big mistake, I should never give birth to you. That's a bit embarrassing. So presumably, when you say prefer being single, we say you should prefer being single in the vast majority of instances, but if you find someone as amazing as your mom, go for it. So, what is our framing on why we're likely to persuade these children to believe us and what happens in the counterfactual? First of all, we build affirmative habits, things like having a certain amount of me time, things like having time for reflection on why you believe that it's important for you to do a certain hobby or whatever. And specifically, this type of habit is focused on you and your personal goals, your personal life in the first place. Often, what this means is that when your partner often wants you to consistently go out with them, spend time with them, or if your friends want you to put a bit more time into like how you look, or for example, go to a club, you recognize that you have this time for yourself to play badminton, or to play games, or to read a book or something. It's very important for you to maintain that identity. Second of all, it's important to build self-confidence outside of relationships. So you criticize the idea that your looks or your relationship attractiveness is important. Note that again, this is comparative, because if the media is extremely likely to push the narrative that if you are someone who is attractive, you are someone who people want to have sex with, you are now more valuable as an individual, particularly if you're a woman. In that instance, when your parents give you that level of comfort at home that these narratives are not reasonable, first, it blocks you from the harm from those narratives because you're more likely to perceive them as wrong. For example, if you grow up with your parents telling you, like, I don't know, every one of the Kellogg's commercials are lying to you, then it's very unlikely they're going to affect you in the first place because you're growing up with the perception they're wrong. So in the same way, the media narratives don't hurt you as badly. But second of all, it means in the future when friends and family and other people around you tell you that, hey, it might be important to be in a relationship, or for example, doubt their own value because of their own lack of attractiveness, for example, you are more likely to believe that your parents had a good point to make in the first place, and even if you do end up agreeing to some extent, you'll end up having that sort of defense mechanism in your head. The third reason you probably persuade them is because your parents' values stick with you in the sense that they're your role models, so they often frame the way in which you view other pieces of information in your life. So if your father and your mother tell you that it's quite important to be single, it's quite important to be an individual who is sort of by themselves, independent, making themselves happy, you don't need other people, and so there's a very high bar before they actually get to date you, then at that point you're probably going to see this as the framework within which you view relationships, and that means that you're unlikely to suddenly become a teenager and hate your parents about all of this. You might rebel a bit, but I'll get into that. So, three simple parts of this. They're similar, so I don't need to make 5 different arguments about them. First of all, why do you make bad decisions as a child, on-site opposition? Second, why does your relationship with your parents get significantly better? And third, why does it make your mental health better when you don't have that much pressure and body image issues, specifically for women? First on bad decisions. Note that first of all, right now often, because your parents might not tell you that you should prefer to be single, they might just tell you, be careful with relationships or whatever. There's an overwhelming pressure for you to get into a relationship to show your legitimacy in a social context, especially as you grow older. And this means that often people are willing to rush into the first few choices that they get. But at the same time, often within relationships, there is a huge pressure to compromise, particularly for your daughter if she's a woman, as to you need to do the things that make you more attractive in the relationship. But it's also true in the sense that if your child is in a relationship and believes that they are going to make good decisions within it, they're often very, very likely to be defensive of criticisms of that decision. Because if you're in a relationship, you feel like it's a private thing that determines your own value. So when your friends tell you this is a bad decision, you get defensive and are unlikely to take it very seriously, especially when you're younger. But third of all, the person you pick is based off of sort of hormones and things maybe like whatever you find pretty, or for example, your preferences at the time, which are often quite arbitrary. And that's really important. You might like someone because you just really like people who do debate. But at the same time, you might end up realizing later that was a bad decision because you weren't mature enough to know the significance of the consequences this can have on you in the first place. Quickly closing opposition.
Yeah, can you please explain how your model meaningfully deviates from like status quo? Insofar as most parents usually don't go to their kids like date as many people as they can, they probably say date to find the special one who makes your life meaningful.
So that is preferring being single in almost all instances. So if you think that's status quo, take it up with the CS. Okay, but second of all, the meaningful difference is all the stuff I said about how when your parents don't explicitly tell you to stay away from relationships, in a way that is telling you that it is a really high bar, it's likely other people fill that gap of narratives. If opposition claims, you will still tell them to be wary of relationships, but look for the right one. I think that is preferring to be single in almost all instances. Okay, so as a result, your bad decisions can do a few things. First, quickly open it up here.
There's a reason why preteen and teenage years are the rebellious stage. So if you know your parents hate you being in a relationship, how would you rebel?
Okay, so if your parents have told you that being single makes you happier, and then as a teenager, you decide that you want to be in a relationship to show your parents that they were wrong, that does not mean you believe that it's making you happier. It means you're rebelling against your parents. Immediately after that, you then go back to the values you believe make you happy. So the only way that you would stick to doing this is if the relationship is the only thing that makes you happy and the frustration that you had against your parents was legitimate. So to prove that, you need to prove that all of these relationships will make these people happy in the first place, while I would argue that the perception you have already that these are going to be bad for you are likely to be harmful to you, so you will end up realizing, fuck, they had a point. Okay. So, these bad decisions mean first, often, your agency to evaluate your options is often taken away from you because you're someone who's often very, very quick at making these decisions, and once you're in a relationship, it's very difficult to go out for the reasons I told you. It's also difficult to be criticized because of the reasons I told you, so you often get locked into bad decisions. Obviously, the impacts of this look like not just abusive relationships, but bad types of relationships which are like codependent, which reduce your ability to make good decisions in the future, and second of all, it also means that you start to move further and further away from your parents when you're in these relationships. You don't interact with them. And you as a parent, other than wanting the best for your child, also want to have a relationship with them so you have capacity to control the things that they do because you care about them. But the second impact of this is often it means that it's more likely you're uncaring about things like pressure and body image, especially if you're a woman. So what does this mean? It means that if you are someone who does not think that relationships are as important as your own personal life, then it is less important to you how attractive you are to other people, because you believe that it is something that other people who are shallow think is very, very relevant. And third of all, even if it is not the case that you believe that, you raise your standards to the point where you think that you need someone who is much, much better than just the first person you meet. So the pressure you have to be better for your partner is completely pushed away by the pressure you have that I can be by myself and still be happy. So relationships have a higher bar to be good in the first place. On that opening up.
We thank the Prime Minister for that speech and give the floor to the Leader of Opposition to open the case for a waiver.
Also from personal experience, your parents don't always know what is going to make you happy. When your parents tell you that you ought to be single, that this is the better option for you, you're going to feel like you've disappointed them if you don't follow that route. You're going to feel like you can't share that information with them. You're going to feel like in the future you resent the things that they told you to do because they didn't end up making you happy in the short term or the long term. A few things I'll do in this speech. First, give some points of setup of what this trade-off actually looks like, unlike what PM gives you. Secondly, talk about how this stigmatizes relationships and thus hurts your child. And finally, talking about why your child staying single is not good for you as a parent. Firstly, then on setup. I think what happens when you raise your child to prefer being single is that you stress that being single has something inherently good about it. That portraying that being in a relationship is a distraction to your career or your academics or your hobbies, as OG wants to talk about. That there's something inherently bad about pursuing a relationship because you'll have less time in other things, because a relationship will always harm you emotionally, physically, whatever that is. I think this is particularly harmful because it is not about just staying independent as PM wanted you to believe. Because as a parent, you can tell your child that, okay, pursue relationships, that's totally fine, I know that you want to do that, but you ought to stay independent in that. That's not what the OG narrative is. The OG narrative is you should not pursue a relationship because you can never be independent in a relationship. Parents can still talk to you on our side about the importance of being independent, but that it can be good to have someone there for emotional and physical support. On their side of the house, you say you can never be independent and single, you can never be independent and in a relationship, so you must stay single. I think also this idea of the lowest possible burden that PM takes on, this idea that, oh, you can still tell your child to find someone as great as mom. In their very best case, even this places such a high pressure and burden on your child that you can only meet that highest standard of someone like mom. I don't think that they're meeting their burden at all, but even in the case that you think that they are, I don't think that this is particularly good for your child. Why then does this narrative stigmatize relationships and hurt your child and their ability to pursue happiness? I think first of all, your child is likely to prefer having a relationship on either side of the house. Why is this the case? I think one, media, movies, books, like all have romantic plot lines, they glorify romance, people are going to want this. But secondly, biologically, humans are drawn to have a companion. Psychologically, you want emotional support, you want to feel like you have that one person for emotional support, but also hormonally, you have physical needs, you often want that to be with a person who you care about and have them fulfill those needs. But thirdly, you're also likely to feel peer pressure in the sense that when your friends have partners, you want to have that same experience, and you need someone to spend time with when your friends also have their own partners and are spending time with those partners. The implication of this argument is not what OG thinks it is. On government, your parent has to be particularly discouraging of relationships to override these existing social pressures. That is to say, they're going to use the strongest language possible to portray relationships as particularly harmful because they know these existing pressures exist. They know that you have physical and emotional desires to be with someone. So they're going to be like, these desires are wrong. You should not pursue these desires. Instead, you should pursue your career, or you should spend more time taking classes, etc. So this is going to be really bad because one, it means they're likely to portray relationships as a trade-off. This is extremely harmful because it means that you think that you can either do one or the other. You think that you can't be successful at both. But secondly, they're likely to emphasize the negative aspects of relationships alone, creating an asymmetry of your perspective of what relationships looks like. This means you're going to be pessimistic about the ability of relationships to last. You're always going to be self-sabotaging yourself when you think your relationships are not going to last very long. But also you're going to think that you're always going to end up being emotionally hurt. You don't think there's a possibility of you being happy. What is the real delta here? Firstly, I think the prospect of relationships brings stress to you on their side of the house. Why is this the case? Because you're socialized from a young age by your parents to see it as a trade-off, you're likely to overthink your relationship, self-sabotage, even when you're happy. But secondly, you think that other things are more important than relationships, so you spend more time trying to focus on work and school, but you're going to find this less fulfilling because these things don't pay off in the short term, they pay off in the long term. There's a lot of uncertainty regarding, even if you get straight A's, are you going to get your dream job, etc. There's going to be far more fear and disappointment when that happens. But thirdly, you're less able to be present in relationships even when you do pursue them. So you're less likely to stay in them for a long time. You break up with your partner because you think that they're going to hurt you in the long term. You're not able to make rational choices when your parents have socialized you in this way. Even in the case that you do get into relationships regardless, you wait longer to begin getting into these relationships, or in the most extreme cases, you don't get into them because you're likely to feel regret, because you're likely to feel like you're going to disappoint your parents when you do this. You're likely to feel like you're making a mistake disobeying them. Because of this, you have an internalized stigma regarding relationships. That means when you finally do start getting into relationships, you're likely to feel regret because you had less experience. You're going to blame your parents for this resentment when you feel like the other people who are of your age group have a lot of experience. Your partner has a lot of experience. There's going to be an inherent power dynamic that's created there when you don't know what to do to be happy, or you don't know how to get into a relationship. Finally here, I think you're not going to be able to talk about it with your parents comfortably because you have a fear that your parents are going to be disappointed with you. Abusive and codependent relationships that OG might talk about become more likely when you need to hide it from your parents because you think you're going to disappoint them because they told you that you ought to have been single, that this is really bad for you. Closing first.
Yeah, all the arguments you make about how you're likely to overthink the relationships that you enter are not comparative, because it's not clear that people are thinking sufficiently about the relationships that they enter right now or are making the right decisions. So what is the alternative?
I think that on your side of the house, when your parents have told you that this is what you ought to do, the people you spend the most time with, who have the most influence over you as a child, you're more likely to overthink this because it has a long-term impact on you, because you think you're making a mistake and that you think maybe your parents did have your best interest. I think in the long term you're going to realize that this wasn't actually right for you. I think this is comparative insofar as it's the effect that your parents have on you. Opening.
So that Ted can actually engage with your case, what is your counterfactual? What are you going to tell the kids in your case, or are you just going to tell them nothing about relationships?
Yeah, I already said this in the setup. What we're going to tell them is it's great to have someone there for your emotional support, someone to be with, that you are able to be independent in those relationships, but that you ought to go out and pursue them. Why then do we think staying single is bad for a parent? I think the previous arguments that I gave you already explain why your child will be unhappy in relationships on their side of the house, but why they're regardless going to pursue them because of the biological and social pressures that they feel. This means that you're going to have resentment towards your parents in the long term, as well as you're going to feel like your parents are getting involved in the most intimate aspects of your life, which is going to create a greater gap and tension with your relationship with your parents. But secondly, I think your parents themselves are not going to want this, because one, you're not going to want your child to feel like they lost out on crucial life experiences, given you want your children to be happy. But secondly, you also, as a parent, want to make sure that your child is going to be taken care of. When your greatest fear and anxiety as a parent is that when you die, there's not going to be anyone there to care and love for your child, no one there for financial, emotional, and physical support when you die. But when your child stays single, the fear becomes even greater. As a parent, you ought to want that your child has someone there for those forms of support. So staying single is not in your best interest. But thirdly, given that people have hormones, given that people want to have like physical needs, etc., your child is likely to turn to hookup culture instead on their side of the house when you don't want to be in a relationship. This means you're likely to be with people who are less trustworthy, who are more likely to take advantage of your body, etc. We think that harms are much greater on their side, very proud to oppose.
Thank the Leader of Opposition for that speech, and give the floor to the DPM to conclude the case for opening government.
Okay.
Yep.
I'll take two POIs successively, one from OO and one from CO. I'll do them back to back because it's just easier for my time management. If I don't, then I guess I'll lose tight comparisons. Alright. Wait, that wasn't supposed to be funny. Alright, cool. Alright. 3, 2. The issue of opening up is that their argument is contingent on a very bad way of parents doing it. I think first of all, we have opening government's fiat, which is we can say that parents will probably do it in a reasonable way. See up all of the stuff that Sharia already said. I'm just going to give you a lot of additional reasons as to why parents likely will frame this in a good way. The first is there are literal limits to how you can frame how bad being in a relationship is, insofar as you are also in a relationship. So at that point in time, you can't just say the relationship is the devil. You have to say there are some good things about it. At that point in time, a lot of their unhealthy conception of relationship therefore goes out of the debate because it's unclear as to why that happens. But second of all, obviously there are checks and balances that exist for the reason that Uma says, which is society indeed counterfactual. It's not one in which people don't know about relationships because popular media, your teachers, your friends, a lot of other things also portray relationships in specific sorts of ways, so you have points of references there. At that point in time, the argument we give you is very simple. There is no choice if your parent also say relationship is good, because then the default perception you have is the only way in which you can find happiness is through relationship. We give a degree of agency and leverage that only exists on our side of the house. But finally, I just think parents oftentimes have capacity and incentive to do this well. Number one, they love their child and oftentimes have other parents who love their child. So you have mutual networks of parenting that are able to consult each other and therefore get information. Second of all, I also just think it is the case that in the vast majority of instances, governments, educational institutions, etc. also have an incentive to also tell parents about how to meaningfully disseminate this information. So unless all of this falls through, I'm not sure why the only way in which the debate works is that parents are going to demonize relationships in all specific instances. And if this is true, it removes the vast portion of opening opposition's push because it is contingent on a really uncharitable characterization of how this debate necessarily works. But here is the flip to this. If everything opening opposition says is true, e.g., the way in which relationships will be framed on their side of the house is that this is your person, this is the person that's supposed to bring you most comfort, then all of their harms are symmetric. Because at that point in time, you also don't want to consult your parents. Because you think if your boyfriend is gaslighting you and you tell your parents about it, you're also disappointing them because you've gone into the wrong relationship. And at that point in time, I think it's far worse for the reason that you actively do a harm to yourself. The comparative is, obviously you're going to think about the way in which you opt into a relationship. If Uma is correct that there's physical and biological urges, eventually you will have a conversation with your mom and say, hey, I'm feeling these hormonal feelings, so I want to get a relationship. Let's talk about why you think being single is better. This is the discourse that never happens on their side of the house because the parents make it sound as though you ought to follow the social norms. That's how we're beating them. I'm going to talk about two chats. First of all, why relationships in the future become significantly worse, and that's where we're reading opening up, and then I'm going to talk about choice. Let's be clear. What does Sharia actually say to zero response to the leader of opposition? Sharia proves that you opt into bad relationships, and I don't think Uma actually responds to this. All Uma says is, your parents will tell you and give you guidance. That is symmetric. If anything, that proves that on our side of the house, we can do this well as well. But there are three reasons Sharia gives that sidesteps this that was critically important. Number one, oftentimes kids are desperate exactly because of the narrative Uma gives, which is that they see in social media everyone else is in a relationship. You oftentimes use that as a heuristic benchmark, and therefore you ought to get one in as well.
all, therefore you're more short-termist, and therefore you get into the first one you see as compared to wait for the best one. But second of all, oftentimes kids are immature, so they don't have the meaningful capacity to gauge what good relationships are until they've been in a really bad one. So the first instance in which you opt into relationships is oftentimes bad. But finally, it is far harder for you to take criticism about what bad relationship is, exactly because of the framing I give, which is you're far more likely to be scared of talking to your parents about it because you do not want to disappoint them. Why is this significantly important? If we prove, which we did, that at the first instance, often you opt into bad relationships, we are winning this debate in 3 ways. Number one, this is a logically prior claim to opening opposition, because if it is the case that you opt into a bad relationship, you don't get any of the fuzzy feeling, you just get a bad relationship when you feel gaslit and you feel as though you were harmed. But second of all, even if you buy all of opening opposition, OO doesn't actually say the word relationship at all in any of your case. They say emotional support. Sharia is my emotional support. They say physical feeling. I can go get a hooker. I can get friends with benefits. I'm genuinely unsure why a lot of the utility of opening opposition is pinned towards relationships. And here is the flip. The hookers and the friends are better on our side. Here is why. Number one, there is accountability, because there is a race to the top when you have multiple different friends, where you're in a monogamous relationship. It is far harder for you to get that, because if your boyfriend is bad, there's no other benchmark of what a good boyfriend is, so you're more likely going to stay in that position. When your friend takes money from you, you just go to the other friend that doesn't take money from you. So there's a mutual accountability mechanism there that doesn't exist on their side. But second of all, it is far easier for your parent to access and be a penetrable force in those specific instances, because you have, for example, connections to your friends. You know your friends' moms as well, things of that nature. But it's far harder to do so in instances of relationship, because it's just one individual, and therefore it's far more circumstantial. At that point in time, we prove why the OO utility is very marginal, and alternatives that exist on our side of the house are better. But three, and this is the most important thing, if it is the case that the first instance of the relationship is bad, we beat OO, because this proves that you don't opt into relationships in the future anymore, because if your first conception of relationship is, there's this asshole who does really bad things to me, you just think relationships are horrible. And oftentimes kids are impressionable for all the reasons opening opposition gives. Therefore, we mechanize the OO claim to prove that if relationships are good, we get more of them in the future that is good, but if they're bad, then we mitigate against that because alternatives exist. At this point in time, we're beating OO. See you.
So conflicting narratives at home and abroad in society don't just balance out. If your parents teach you creationism and school teaches you evolution, you don't meet somewhere in the middle, you're going to choose one of those and have conflict in your life.
No, but the thing is we have discourse, because you ask your parents why it's the case that they have that opinion. That discourse never happens on your side. I'm going to weigh that later, but before that, opening up.
OG is not engaging with the burden. To make your child prefer being single, as the motion says, you have to override the existing narratives that glorify relationships. Otherwise, your child is not going to prefer being single, which is how you want to raise them.
Yeah, sure, you can override it, but just say it's good eventually. I don't think the way we frame this debate is unreasonable. But beyond that, I think we prove why actively children opt into bad relationships. So even if it's the case that you lose out on future relationships, we at least mitigate an immediate harm, which is your child crying to you when they're 16, saying that they've been lied to and the award has been taken away from them. That is immediate benefit that the parent gets. Finally, let's talk about choice. Opening up is correct. Alternative is not vacuum. Alternative is a world in which heteronormativity largely exists. One, because of media. Two, because there's a negative first mover advantage in doing things like coming out. So the vast majority of people either try to be straight passing or appear straight. The issue with all of this is, absent your parent giving you an alternative narrative, the perception is very clear. You ought to get in a relationship, that relationship ought to be straight. This is the way in which, unfortunately, the structures and the powers of the world have been set up. Why is therefore this important? Number one, you change that because you make it seem as though there is an alternative pathway to accessing a different type of happiness, which is important because even if you don't believe in being single, the point is at least you know there's another way in which you can find happiness and another type of relationship model, which means you're more likely going to consider that and therefore you can get utility because as a parent, you don't know the preferences of your child. So maximizing the optionalities of that child is the most important thing because it underlies the utility that that child gets. But second of all, this kickstarts a discussion that will never happen. Because I don't think it's the case that you just rebel against your parents like irrationally. You often have a conversation first because that is easier to do than just like throw a rock at your mom. At that point in time, that discussion never happens on their side, so it's far better on our side of the house. For all those reasons, opening up.
Thank the Deputy Prime Minister, and just before we go on, just a note to everyone, just to whisper less, with less volume, just because we're far from the speaker and it sometimes interferes. Thank you. And give the floor to the DLO to wrap up the case for top half.
OG's strategy in this round is to abusively set up what the comparative is. Because for some reason, they can talk about having confidence and independence independence during relationships, but we cannot. But for some reason, they want their kids to prefer staying single, but they also advocate for the end goal of marriage and finding someone as good as your mom. And on our side of the house, we can't just endorse having relationships as a beautiful idea in general, but we have to support our kids getting into every single relationship. That's not the reasonable comparative in this debate, and yet we're still going to tell them why even if they can defend this really swirly model of how they will in general discourage relationships, but they will also encourage a committed relationship at the end, even then, that will pressure their kids into worse decisions on their side. So there are three things I'm going to talk about as to why O takes this round. Firstly, why they stigmatize relationships, and that exacerbates the worst harm that could possibly come out. Two, why they actually pressure their kids into worse decisions. But lastly, even if some bad decisions are made on our side, some relationships are not good, in the end, and don't last, that is still good when we help the kids have better life experiences and stuff like that. Firstly then, on stigmatizing relationships, because all the concerns from gut bench, like overthinking, red flags, abusive relationships, and dependency, these are all going to be issues prominent in society on either side of the house. The actual core fundamental issue is kids with no romantic experience can't identify these red flags, they get out of the relationship before it occurs. So the solution to that problem is talking to your parents, to therapists, to friends, anything, to verbalize that you have a relationship or something that is developing so that you can get that knowledge and experience and identify the red flags and get out. So if we prove to you that they associate shame or bad qualities about myself with me being in a romantic setting and in a relationship, this proves that all the problems get worse on their side. Because then I feel internalized shame if I think I'm romantically involved. I will think I'm now dependent. I'm now not an independent woman or 21st century empowering person because of the fact that I'm romantically involved with someone. Then I'm unlikely to talk to my therapist about this developing or verbalize this to my friends because it feels real and it feels like an insult to myself. So, as long as we prove to you, there's shameful and stigmatizing narratives about being in a relationship on their side, all the harms about overthinking and red flags are exacerbated on theirs. So why is it that when parents want their kids to prefer to be single, this must be done in a strong and stigmatizing tone? It's because currently, everything else in society glorifies having a relationship. The government tells you family is the ultimate unit of society. Media tells you with Romeo and Juliet, like Disney movies, that love is literally the answer to every single thing, and they paint it as a beautiful story. So when a parent needs to tell you that being single is better than this glorious thing that exists on media, they have to actively push down whatever this glorifying narrative is by telling you Romeo and Juliet is literally stupid. Look at how disempowering Rapunzel is, or the Little Mermaid is literally not a feminist, and they're like, this is really terrible for her health and stuff like that. So all these things mean that they have to do it in a stigmatizing tone that is strong and associate these qualities like being dependent, like being not empowering with women on their side of the house in order to make this narrative survive. Uma tells you that you're going to get into a relationship on either sides of the house by painting to you that we just have urges, hormones, like social forces are going to push us into it when we seek stability and stuff like that. So what this means is on either side of the house, you're subjected to bad people who are going to try to abuse you and gaslight you in relationships. But when you don't talk about it, because you're stigmatizing yourself, it is way more likely for these harms to manifest and you actually get into a relationship or a long-term relationship with these individuals. On our side of the house, when we tell you you should explore relationships, it's a beautiful thing. We can also still tell you there are bad people out there. There are like people who are going to try to abuse you and take advantage of you, but you should come talk to me, and they will, because they feel comfortable knowing my parents recognize my romantic self and romantic side, and that is not stigmatized on our side. We have way more conducive conversations on our side of the house, and that's how we avoid all these harms. But secondly, let's talk about avoiding pressuring people into bad decisions. Here's where there's this actually very time sensitive when they want to talk about pressuring you into a relationship when it's not a good thing. I think preteens and teens are very subject to what they talk about as the pressuring force, like hormones, like peer pressure, social media glorifying relationships. If you're 25, 27, 28, you're likely a rational person who has experienced more, they can identify for yourself what is happiness, and I'm not going to put myself in a super uncomfortable position just to satiate other people, because it's no longer the high school, middle school dynamic of being popular. We've kind of outgrown that in our developmental phases. What's the issue then? They actually make it much, much worse for the most irrational actors, the preteens and teenagers, to be pressured into a relationship on their side of the house, because it is seen as rebellious, it is seen as cool, especially when your parents declare that they're super, super anti-relationship. What's the analogy? If my parents go like, you cannot drink in college, drinking is super bad, that's exactly why college-age students and high school students who are not supposed to be drinking abuse this substance the most and go crazy on nights out. That is what they're going to do on their side when kids are more reckless in relationships or opt into it first. The most time-sensitive actors are the most harmed on their side of the house. Sure, opening.
So even if you're correct that stigma exists, you can at least talk with therapists and other individuals because they're not part of the parental stigma. The difference is you think relationship is the only option, so you lose out on choice, which is an exclusive.
No. I associate with being dependent, disempowering, and not my own person with being in a relationship after my parents drill this in me. Then even if I verbalize, I have a boyfriend, I feel myself yourself dependent and disempowered. So you wouldn't verbalize that to anyone on your side when you associate shame with the act of being in a relationship. Moving on then, how do we avoid like these people going into bad decisions? First, talking to parents because like we don't think they're going to literally tell us we're being wrong. But two, if you're in a relationship, it's easier to break up on our side of house. Because what Sharia said is, my parents will think it's okay if I'm in a relationship if this person is as special as my mom and I'm going into it with the intention of it lasting for a very long time. So if I break up, then my parents will be like, I told you so, I told you rushed into it, this is not a serious relationship. They'll be like, look, like you're literally a mistake, you're stupid, you're not doing what we say. So if I'm in a relationship, in this situation, they trap these kids in that relationship and they push them into continuing this bad decision on their side of the house because they fear, because their parents are only okay with very stable and long-term things. Tejas.
If the messaging of parents is in some key ways consistent with the media and social media narratives you describe, doesn't that make kids rely a lot more on institutions like media and social media narratives because they trust them now, causing a lot of the harms that these institutions can?
No, that's not true, because my parents can comment on media and give me certain clarifying things, like, look, it is true, love is pretty, you can have these things, but also, if a Flynn rider shows up to your tower, that's really scary, maybe that's a little bit creepy. They can make clarifying things and still say, yeah, love is beautiful, like, go explore for yourself. I'm unsure why our parents are just dumb on our side of the house. Media can be used in a selective way, like, you don't have to watch Little Mermaid, you can watch more empowering 21st century movies about love on our side of the house as well. So moreover, even if there are harms, it is still okay. Even if you're pressured into bad relationships, like they said they've both been in bad relationships, they're still here and doing well. Because, like, ultimately, it's unrealistic for you to just immediately find who your mom is, like the special person who you're gonna marry forever. You need some bad relationships to figure out what you like and what you don't like in order to, like, for you to find the person who can commit to you, who you actually think is good. In the process, even if it's terrible, you learn more about yourself when you go through the ups and downs, when you lean on your friends, when you cry and experience the heartbreak that you hear about in music. All these are still beautiful life experiences that Uma tells you has inherent value. And the comparative is even worse when Uma tells you about hookup culture, how they're more to instrumentalize you for your body and stuff like that. The most important thing is problems in relationships always will exist, and relationships always will exist. Who talks about them? Who stigmatizes them? That's the delta in this round. We're so proud to oppose.
We thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that speech and hope in the second half of the debate we give the floor to the Member of Government.
Dad, sorry, Arthur, Dad said he was a big fan of you. I'm very touched. Maybe you won't be after this speech, but. So we agree with opening a government that it is true that many people enter into bad relationships when they are young. What opening half didn't focus on is how being single when young actually helps you build better friendships and relationships in the future and better separate emotional relationships and things like sexual intimacy for your entire life versus just what happens to you in your 20s. Opening government mentions why friendships are important, but they don't explain how parents can facilitate these friendships, as well as why having these stable friendships helps you build better relationships, romantic and sexual relationships in the future. 2 points of extension. Firstly, about friendships, how raising children to want to be single is better for them in building sustainable and stable friendships, where we engage with the wider case where people choose to be single as well. Secondly, additional reasons why this is good for people regardless of whether they choose to get into relationships in the future or not. But before that, some refutation. So there's this idea from opening half, that opening opposition, that we'll get into a relationship on either side, and therefore children should be guided by parents who support them in having these relationships rather than forcing them to be single. Firstly, I think this is a weird characterization of what the media says. So their argument is that the media will sort of coerce children into these relationships. It is not clear that this is what the media does. A lot of modern media actually supports independence and self-reliance, and as the underlying message that people can be happy without necessarily being in a long-term monogamous relationship. I just don't think this necessarily accurately represents what the media does. Also, we think that the pressure to enter or remain in a stable or long-term relationships actually doesn't come from the media, but often comes from parents themselves, especially in conservative societies. So this is a thing that we can change by changing the messaging associated with what you tell your children. It comes from like the extended family, for example, where the parents are therefore directly placed to be able to counter this messaging from extended family members. So we think that much of the pressure to enter this relationship actually doesn't necessarily come from the media, as what was characterized from opening opposition. They also have this point that kids will be rebellious, and therefore telling them not to enter relationships will make them
more likely to enter these relationships. I think this is symmetric to the extent that their side also supports parents being role models and encouraging stable or healthy relationships as well. It's not clear why perhaps that kids won't be rebellious on either side, right? Moreover, this presumes the worst possible model of parental authority. This presumes that parents will just stop their kids from entering into relationships. And while this is true of many Asian families, I don't think that this necessarily is the model that we have to defend on our side. We think that for a number of structural reasons, many parents have been in relationships themselves, they understand what it feels like, and they want to compensate for that. Parents don't want their kids to hate them. And moreover, the model what is likely to happen on our side is that parents will, for example, tell their kids to remain friends rather than enter into a relationship with someone who asks them out. So we're talking about more subtle forms of messaging that don't directly outright prohibit kids from entering into relationships. Because, we all know that kids will be rebellious, and therefore parents probably know that too, right? So we don't think that this will be the most, they won't engage in the most blatant form of parental authority. First argument, that it's better for children in terms of building long-term friendships. So Orwell mentions that friends are good because they can support you from multiple angles, but they don't explain why parents can facilitate children entering into meaningful friendships, and what happens to these friendships after children pass from parental authority and grow up. We think that parents can encourage the children to form more meaningful long-term friendships in a number of ways. Firstly, when they're young, they can control the kids, the other children that their kids sees and who they interact with. Therefore, they can facilitate these friendships from forming. Moreover, we think that parents are the first people that many kids come to for help with interpersonal friendships and relationships. And therefore, teaching them good norms, teaching them how to build healthy interpersonal friendships and relationships helps them build these long-term friendships which are supportive and important in the future. Why is this mutually exclusive, then, from being in relationships and from telling your kid that you should support them in being in a relationship? Firstly, when dating someone, most of your time is spent with the person. This cuts out a lot of avenues to grow and build healthy interpersonal friendships with other people who are not your romantic partner, especially when kids are in school. Secondly, toxic relationships, which we have to admit are like a large number of relationships that people enter when young, actually insulate you from having friends because often your partner wants to spend more time with you. Third, most relationships fail when they're young, and therefore burning bridges with the person you are dating stops you from being friends in the future, and therefore you cut off another potential person that could support you. So therefore this is mutually exclusive. Why are friendships better? Firstly, different friends have different comparative advantages. They may help you and make you a better person in different ways. They might support you financially, emotionally, and religiously, and in many different ways that a single partner is not able to. Secondly, in the future, having a larger group of friends helps you cope if you want to enter these relationships because you have a support network to fall on. If you are, for example, kicked out of a relationship, have nowhere to live, or you just need some kind of emotional solace and support. So we think that having this strong network of friendships built up when you are young actually supports you in the future. Third, if we validate or support people having sexual relationships but not entering long-term monogamous relationships, I think that it's better placed to help children learn to disentangle sexual intimacy and romantic relationships. In a moment, Orwell had this argument about why kids will then engage in hookup culture, and this is bad because people who engage in hookup culture are bad people. There's no analysis at all about why this is true, and I just don't think that this makes sense, right? Closing off. Yeah.
Oh yeah, so, sorry, why are these things actually mutually exclusive? In high school, and I'm sure many other people, had someone, also hung out with other people, and those things were completely mutually exclusive, right?
I don't know how popular you were, but I've given you reasons why this is mutually exclusive, things like toxic relationships, the time you have, and so on. So I think, I think that this is fairly mutually exclusive, and also the way your parents, the time that your parents have to spend to guide you with building healthy relationships versus building healthy friendships makes this fairly mutually exclusive. So we help kids not just right now, but for the rest of their lives. We think this is very important. Additional reasons why this helps. Second point of extension about why this is good for people regardless of whether they enter into a relationship or not. Firstly, we think that entering a relationship in a moment gives you limited mobility and financial stress. Being locked into a relationship or a series of relationships when you're young causes you a lot of your harms entering your 30s. Financial mobility is limited because you might choose where to live based on your partner, and also this makes people emphasize, rather than self-reliance, the idea that they must do what the partner does. Opening.
Biologically, romantic awakenings don't occur until you're in 8th grade. Why can't friendship-building norms be built since preschool, when your parents do actually have power over who you interact with, not in high school?
I mean, as you grow up, the types of friendships that you have to navigate and interact with become more complex. You have to talk about things that 8th graders don't talk about. So I think that at that period, building friendships, and most of your friendships happen are formed after 8th grade. So in that case, this is when having parents support you in building friendships are important. So moving on, we think that this makes people emphasize self-reliance and their own personal aims above and beyond the expectation. to get married, and this is important both from like a financial or career perspective. Secondly, being in a relationship is just not possible or a good choice for many people, and what we want to do is to validate them in light of the social pressure and the pressure from extended family who want to get married. Why is this not possible for people? People may be aromantic or asexual. Demographic imbalances may make it impossible for some children to just enter long-term relationships. Like in China, there are 122 males for every woman that is born, for example. As a consequence of this, it's not possible for many of these people to get into relationships. The career path you choose may make it harder for long-term relationships. Like if you want to work in, like, I don't know, the diplomatic service or something where you have to move from place to place, it might be hard for you to do that and simultaneously aspire to be in romantic relationships. So for many of these people, validating them and saying it is okay to choose to be single in light of the messaging from media and extended family is actually incredibly beneficial, and we want to support them. We're proud to stand in closing comments.
We thank the member of government for that speech, and to open the case for seal, we give the floor to the member of opposition.
I mean, I can't stop you from giving verbal POIs, but like, you don't need to, just raise your hand. I promise I will still take it. Starting in 3, 2, 1. For a This House Would motion, it is shocking that no other team has actually explained how parents would actually enforce either side of this debate, insofar as parents do not literally write out a list of rules for life and give it to you. Even in the case where they would, like the World Style Guide, doesn't literally unlock the ability to break at worlds. It's actually a lot of application and practice. So even if you had a book about, here's like, on your 12th birthday, give you a book on how to have a relationship, wouldn't be very effective. A couple points of refutation against a CG case, and we'll move on with the CO extension. 3.3. Number 1, I think it's just untrue that media is supportive of being single. Name like any sort of media that children consume that doesn't have a relationship. Star Wars ends with like them being like Han Solo and Leia. Harry Potter, constant fucking love triangles. Like The Office, like everyone who ends up happy at the end is happy because they're in a relationship. Even characters, they spent like 9 seasons being chronically single and miserable, like that. I can't remember her name, the one in the like the finance department. She was only happy when she started dating Dwight. I think it is deeply important to recognize how ridiculous a lot of the conceptions of the government case is, insofar as mostly A, relationships are either seen as net good, or B, even when they are bad, it is usually the case that they leave them for someone better. So it's just not true that on balance you are more likely to consume media that promotes singleness. I think it's also true that the kinds of relationships that are promoted are very heteronormative and very much based on like nuclear families, i.e. it is very rare that people consume media that presents polyamory as anything other than like devious and scandalous. It's very rare that you consume media that presents queer relationships as like something can just be positive. It's always got to be some like deep angst. And although it's very true, it's difficult to be in a queer relationship, it's hard to consume media that is actively positive. Especially if your parents are telling you that relationships are not good, you are unlikely to value media narratives that promote them, because you'll see that cognitive dissonance as my partner POI, that look, if I'm taught to believe relationships aren't very good, I'm not really going to care as much about, for example, any media I do consume that presents like just like Heartstopper, just like a happy queer relationship, because I just believe it's probably not that valuable anyway, and I'm unlikely to access the benefits that can come for like a 12-year-old reading that kind of novel. Second response is CG, that like parents are deeply involved in your friendships. Again, I really don't think the average person is doing that. A lot of times parents have rules like if you have a friend over, you have to leave the door open. In the case that it's like friendships, parents are overbearing and assume that it's going to lead to a relationship. That kind of thing, even if it is just about friendships, and these, because parents assume they're like, my kid's gonna start dating anyone of the opposite gender that they bring over to the house, you are likely to be deeply avoidant about talking about even the friendships you have, even if it's not romantic. And where it is romantic, no fucking way the average 15-year-old is like, hey mom, like I just like made out with someone in the school bathroom like at recess. That's not the kind of conversation you have. The reason we win on making good relationships is because we are proactive. When parents are able to say, look, relationships can be great, here's how you do them correctly, and it's important that when you do try them, that you do them low stakes in a way where you're not like, my whole life matters on being able to stay with this person forever. And that proactiveness allows you to have those conversations before it's awkward. Because it's awkward to come home crying and say, my heart was broken because I thought this boy would be with me forever, and your parents say, well, you're a fucking idiot, I told you that's never going to happen. It's a lot easier for the parent to initially say, look, it's really great to be in a relationship so long as you do it right, and here are some ways that you can try it, here's some ways you can do it without stigma, and you're going to get it wrong, and that's okay. Third response here about mutual exclusivity. Just not fucking true. I'm going to take a guess. The average person in this room probably does debate. We all have school, we all have friends, we have family. I think we are capable of balancing those kinds of things. It's not you can't just say it's mutually exclusive to do dating. In fact, it's less mutually exclusive on our side where you can do things like casual dating. Just date someone for 3 months, and if you're bored, dump them. If you aren't enjoying it, leave. Find someone else. It's harder to be, it's actually more mutually exclusive when you believe that every person that you go out on a date with is going to be the person you have to put a lot of time and effort into every single time because they're going to be the one. So it's when you set the stakes really high. The date that I'm going on tonight might be the one. Where on our side, if it's just like, yeah, I'm going to Earl's and I'm like, maybe they'll buy me dinner, it'll be fun, is you're just going to less likely to trade off important things on our side of the house. All right, on to the extension case here. I think importantly, parents don't give you rules to follow. What it looks like is subtle forms of giving hints about how relationships work. So for example, it's subtextual in terms of like, my family and I would watch like this like hospital drama, and we would talk about it after watching. My parents might say, I don't like that new relationship they just wrote into the show. And I get subtle cues from that about what my parents believe are good or bad relationships. It's also deeply personal. So it looks like parents telling, hey, here are some boundaries that you should probably set. But those boundaries are likely to be different for every person. So again, I have some friends that are in long-term relationships, that are in open relationships, but they don't talk about it. Whereas other relationships are open, but they do talk about like who they've had sex with and that kind of thing. There are degrees to which people can enjoy certain boundaries, and even when you give them rough hints, it's largely only through actually trying them that you are able to do that. I think importantly, panel, because you aren't literally giving your kid a rule book of like up to this point, your boyfriend like giving you advice is good, but this point it becomes controlling. It is only through actually trying it and being able to openly discuss with your parents without the stigmatization that you are able to find a balance that is likely to be good for you. The reason this is incredibly important is on our side of the house, number one, you are able to explore relationships that are unlikely to be represented in media or through the kinds of relationships that your parents might have. Again, if you grew up in a nuclear family in the suburbs, you watched like Star Wars, Harry Potter, The Office, you are only exposed to a certain form of media. On our side of the house, where you are able to engage in low-stake relationships that are unlikely to be reflective of the broad social norms, you are also likely to not be caught up in the very really obvious tropes and flags. So on the government side of the house, where you consume a lot of media before you start dating, because you never date anyone as a teenager, the only way you learn about what makes a relationship good is often from media your parents. You think that a guy showing up at your house unexpectedly with flowers is romantic. That's actually really fucking inconvenient and annoying, but you wouldn't know that if you never dated, but you do on our side of the house. Yes?
If both sides have people trusting their parents, then the reason they wouldn't talk to them is because they feel like they lose what they wanted so badly, which is their relationship, if they fuck it up. At that point, the only way they talk is if they feel there's another option, being single, unlocking friendships, and unlocking safety.
Yes, so importantly, panel, I think on our side of the house, we don't have to say that being in a relationship is just inherently the right thing. It's actually that relationships can be a good thing, but that they are not, when they happen, going to be necessarily high stakes. I think that is the nuance that, although I wouldn't just as O said, just keep saying OG's uncharitable, I think it's unstrategic on their part to try and assume that we are only defending a world in which we tell people, only be in relationships, you're only happy when you're married. On balance, I think we have a couple things. We, number one, avoid the prioritization and buy-in to media tropes that flag, this is what, a guy who throws rocks at your window at midnight is someone that loves you and is someone who's romantic. That's just not realistic, and you only learn that on our side of the house by dating someone, like a shitty high school boyfriend who just isn't that great, or just dating someone who's, very good but doesn't do those overly romantic things, and you can learn that love can manifest in different ways. You are likely to experience relationships without buying into preset norms. You literally just follow your heart, which I know sounds like a cheesy map, but is literally something important to this debate, whereas on their side, you follow, again, what social norms you were given, and given that parents are only able to give hints, i.e. they don't give you a literal rule book of how to date, it's unlikely they are even able to accrue their benefits. The best way to learn is to do it yourself, and that is what we get on our side, because no list of parental advice is going to be effective or clear. That's why they can't win this debate. So proud to oppose.
We thank the member of opposition for that speech and give the floor to the government whip to conclude the case for side government.
Around there. Two questions. First, is the way parents communicate these messages helpful and effective? And second, what are the long-term effects on your life of entering relationships where we engage far more charitably with than open in government, and explain why in many cases, being single for significant parts of your adult life is substantially better for you as an individual. On the first question, is this parental messaging actually effective? On front half, open in government does argue quite persuasively that parents don't want to pick the worst possible parenting strategies. They offer arguments, for example, like parents have been in relationships themselves, so active prohibition and the knowledge of the rebelliousness of kids means parents will obviously not engage in the most toxic forms of trying to convince kids to not enter relationships. However, they are caught in a bind, because as opening opposition themselves and as opening government themselves point out, things like social media, things like the media narratives that you're exposed to, and the impulses from peers and communities around you pressure you to enter relationships. And so in order for OG to access the offsetting of this pressure, opening opposition points out, in many cases parents have to pick the worst possible forms of messaging or be extremely coercive. Remember, opening government's benefits rely on parents doing this well. However, given that they themselves describe the nature of media narratives creates so much pressure, they don't prove that parents can simultaneously do this well and offset the range of pressures that kids face. I think Arthur does this, which is the prerequisite for accessing their benefits. The first thing we tell you is that media is not a monolith. It is not true that all media just glorifies entering relationships in a particularly toxic way. Sure, it's true that media doesn't say be single, but there are lots of media options that involve, for example, prioritizing relationships and love outside the context of romance. So Frozen, for example, prioritizing sisterly love, or movies about or prioritizing things like friendships. And the key point here is that parents are also involved in media choice, not just the comments they make on media that kids watch. So for example, parents are the first people to choose what movie a kid is exposed to when they're growing up or making a decision of what art they consume, which also affects the media they watch when the parent isn't with them to comment on the objectifying nature of the TV show that they end up watching. So on our side, it's more likely that parents make good decisions about the types of media that people are exposed to, especially since a lot of parents are making decisions like this, so the demand for this media exists and increasingly exists in the future. That's why The Office is a show from 2003, and also, as a consequence, the decision of media choice is a massive decision that parents are only able to make in a capable way on our side. Remember, closing government themselves tell you what parents end up doing is sending subtle cues. So a parent aggressively commenting on media as objectifying or saying this is creepy behavior doesn't work because they're not going to do it. They're going to send subtle cues, or you're going to not watch the movie with a parent but with a peer instead. So in that context, knowing that your parent exposed you to media like Frozen and knowing that that media exists is the crucial offsetting narrative that you need when you're exposed to other forms of media as a kid. The second thing that Arthur gives you is he actually explains why parents are able to balance having a good message and being effective in employing this message. And this engages with opening opposition. Because opening opposition says people default to relationships, there are extremely toxic social narratives out there, and therefore we need parental influence. What Arthur explains is that opening government's mechanisms about parenting influence are actually stronger than any alternatives. And this is where I'm going to directly respond to their claim that parental influence can't possibly offset the strength of media narratives. 4 reasons they can, 4 responses to opening opposition. 1, because of repetitiveness. Kids have way more access to parental messaging than the messaging of things like their peers because they simply spend way more time with them. And that time, the fact that they are constantly being exposed to a singular message, especially when kids are impressionable and process simple messages easier, is the types of messages that kids are more likely to buy into. The second is that parents are often way more persuasive than things like peers because parents have unique knowledge of their kids. They have knowledge of what persuades them. They have knowledge of the likes that their kid has, and this knowledge combined with the trust that opening government identifies is the prerequisite to actually convince your kid to make long-term decisions about your life, especially when kids are sufficiently impressionable, especially when they are young or in middle school or in early high school, that the things that parents tell them can affect their very long-term future decisions. Third, that parents simply have access to you earlier. So at the point where you're impressionable, maybe you don't face as much peer pressure because kids aren't thinking about relationships in their lives. And that's the point where parents have access to you and access to messaging about you. Fourth, it's also about the way you raise your kids. So for example, teaching them to value friendships and value love while they are still in high school allows you to learn to do that well into the future when you enter other kinds of relationships. As a consequence, it is likely that parental messaging is effective even given that parents make the decision to not be extreme, which is the prerequisite for opening government to access their benefits. No. But the second question I want to ask therefore is what the effects of entering relationships actually are. So here opening opposition says you overthink your relationships, you self-sabotage, without giving you any comparative, any explanation of why you think sufficiently about the relationships you enter in your life right now. No, thank you. What Arthur gives you is he engages with this much more substantial burden, which is in many cases, it is true that you will end up being single for significant parts of your life. But opening opposition says, well, relationships offer unique joy and catharsis. What Arthur explains is in many cases that's far outweighed by the damage that relationships do to your ability to form other forms of emotional bonds and love. And this is further than just parents being involved in your relationship decisions, it's also about what relationships do to your life. Before that, opening.
Parents can't control the media their children consume, but even if parental narratives can be stronger, teens are going to develop crushes because of romantic urges and not know how to respond. If you don't want to disappoint your parent, you won't seek out their advice and instead act irrationally and hide from them.
I just explained why you're unlikely to hide from your parents, because parents are likely to approach this in a way that is actually sensitive to the needs of their kids, but kids are likely to listen to them anyway. This is prerequisite on parents doing this in a bad way, but I explained why they are not likely to. So what are the concrete effects of entering relationships on the rest of your life in a way that significantly damage your everyday life? The first is you're more likely to and this addresses their mutual exclusivity response. First, you're more likely to concentrate all your trust in one person. That means you don't have many different people to meet different emotional needs that you have access to or that you need. Second, you're less likely to find massive devastation from a relationship ending. You're less likely to put all your stakes on that one first date that they cared about, because that could be your one true love. When the date goes badly, you're devastated after and you don't have anyone to turn to. The third is we can separate sexual bonds and emotional intimacy. So for example, different people can fulfill different needs in your everyday life, and that is critical. The fourth is we get rid of financial stress. When you have access to flexibility in your life, especially parts of your life like your 20s, like making a decision of what job you want or when you move, you face less financial stress, and financial stress impedes your ability to enjoy the very relationships that they care about. Incredibly proud to stand for a life that is maybe not different from the norm, but is nonetheless a far healthier life for most people to experience.
We thank the Governor Whip for that speech, and to conclude this debate as a whole, we give the floor to the Opposition Whip.
Everyone ready?
Panel, I never thought I'd hear Arthur telling me lived experience is too cool to be included in a debate. I think this matters in this round, because I want to note that a lot of their case relies on, I think, a pretty unfair conception of what probably most people's younger life. I also just want to note something that I think is important to this round, insofar as I think the round robin's trying to emphasize engagement. I don't think CG's whip identified our case once. They can think it's derivative if they want, but they need to explain why that's the case. We're going to explain why it has some similar norms. It actually brought all the critical pieces that they were trying to engage with. But no, they didn't actually do any of that, and I think that was their job as a whip. That is a fundamental lack of engagement that I do think that should matter in this round. Okay, moving on then to, I'll rebut their case properly, proper engagement. Of course, I'll take PY like they did from us so that they can properly engage with our case. And then I will move into more of the top half debate, why we unlock the impacts that OO was trying to get, and why we actually think we just have the best characterization of what these actual relationships look like, and how, we actually provide the mechanisms of how, when you talk to your kids, it isn't in a super formulaic way, why my partner actually gave you the mechanisms that will unlock all the impacts of OO in this round. So first of all, let's just talk about CG. First of all, I think there was like some genuine like borderline like extension stuff like coming out of the CG, but I'll try and engage with what I can. First one in the last 15 seconds was this idea of financial stability. Let's just be very, very clear. The worst possible time to make bad decisions is immediately like after college. The first person you marry, if that is, which is I think what's likely to happen, you think, is that's where you get shackled into those types of things and you face more things. On our side, you aren't able to access, if you are always single in life, a lot of the benefits that society has put in place for all the reasons that wants to tell you about the societal norms, like lower taxes for married couples, all these types of things. The fact that you often can't even rent if you're single at a certain age because people assume there's something wrong with you. These are the types of subtle differences that exist within society. So if you care about finance at all, noting that came out in like the last minute, I think that's kind of important on our side because again, society's set up for people who are in relationships. So if you just care about your kid's financial future, probably on our side. But more importantly, we tell you that we have the kids make the mistakes when it matters least, i.e. in high school, i.e. when you're unlikely to damage your financial future, get into a marriage where you're now shackled with the debt of your abusive partner. These types of things are far less likely to occur on our side because honestly, the worst thing that happens in most high school relationships, I'm not here to minimize trauma that some people experience, but for most people it's usually just like a dumb fling that ends. And why is this important? Because, and this is directly engaged with some of the CG material, who do you go to when your high school relationship fails? Your friends, right? Like that's what you talk about. Being in a relationship often are like parts of high school that deeply matter. These are the things that a lot of people talk about. It may not be great, we may not like it, but I'd like to note in this motion, this is an individual single parent. No one has any fiat to change what broader societal norms exist. All you can do is operate within those. And this really matters because these are the conversations you have. Your child wants to talk about the relationship with them. Like again, it's not just my experience, but probably the most that often people date within their friend group. You hang out as a group together with partners and non-partners, that kind of stuff. Like this idea that all of high school, basically you have to choose to either make meaningful friendships or be in a relationship, I just think it's like by definition a false dichotomy. I actually think, and importantly, this is where we go over top of them, is that uniquely you actually benefit from both those things. It's probably helpful to learn about relationships and also how to balance that with friends. Because guess what? If you eventually get the perfect marriage at OG once, you probably want some experience in balancing your significant other and your friends and other commitments and relationships. That's probably some experience that you want. I want to note that uniquely at that time, those are when those relationships matter most. The other stuff on their stuff is just media. Like we can go back and forth the trading examples on like what media tells you or not. I think broadly what it happens is the types of influences you have will also be catered by what you look at kind of thing. So right, like the very things that you look up are going to impact what kind of things you're shown, right? So if you like couples on Instagram, it's going to keep sending you couples on Instagram and stuff like that. And this is important because these types of decisions that you're told are part of the media influence. But I would still say my partner's characterization, again, like genuinely, I'm pretty sure society's overarching norm, not just on social media, but actually broader society largely pushes for couples. Those are things brought my partner. Before I move on to Fred.
When parents emphasize the beauty of love, the subtle cue that they end up sending to their kids about this very problematic media tropes you described is that this media is worth watching in contexts where parents don't have the opportunity to comment on it. Therefore, the subtle cues that these parents send are actually the ones that glorify the media tropes your extension is worried about. A response I gave to your extension, by the way, and you ignored.
I think very important, I mean, I haven't ignored it yet because I'm still speaking. I think what's really important in this particular example that is given is, again, what this probably looks like, again, is more your parents saying, oh, like, when you come home crying, like, oh, I remember my first high school boyfriend, yeah, he wasn't that great, or high girlfriend, whatever way you mean kind of thing. And I think this is important because these are the types of things. It's not just like the movies, like, again, yeah, probably when you're like 19, you may not be watching a lot of movies with your parents, but uniquely when they tell you when you're younger, that's when you're watching things. And again, that's when your parents are part of it. We think it's actually uniquely important that they tell you, hey, existing under the current social hegemony and the current things that people are telling you, here's how to navigate that in the right way, rather than pushing back against it, because in often cases you're going to reject it. It's actually about having that conversation within that context. That's what my partner tells you. It isn't just like one or the other. It isn't just clashing narratives, but uniquely saying, hey, here's this narrative about love, here's why some reasons are flawed, here's why some reasons aren't. But those are things that only happen when you engage with it, rather than constantly clashing with it. Oh, yeah, Fred has to go ahead before I go on to your
We explain why relationships feel like your entire world and you don't want to talk to other people. Thus, we give you the option of believing there is a life outside of these relationships,
even if you give them explanations of why there's better ones, you don't explain to them why this one doesn't matter enough.
Like, I just don't know who these people are that never talk about their relationships with anyone other than their partner. But at worst, they're probably far more likely to be isolated when they can't relate to a vast majority of society who values these relationships. For good or bad reasons, that is unchanged within this debate. Let's talk about OG. First of all, on their burden. I don't think it's just like an auto loss. I do think it's extremely uncharitable and low burden. But I also think matters in this debate is they aren't going to access a lot of their impacts if they take the smallest possible delta, right? This idea, like, I don't think, again, that modern society is like, just date whoever you want, who cares, whatever. It's probably telling you this, date to try and eventually find someone you love. I don't think that's meaningful differential, but they don't have to say. But also, even if you take them at their best, they have literally the worst possible outcomes that occur when they tell you, hey, the only people you should date are the person you love. You're probably going to have a lot more pushback from your parents for anyone you bring home because it is assumed to be the only person that matters within your life. Moving finally on to OO, right? I'm not going to sit here and pretend that they didn't have a good case, but what I think uniquely happened within this debate is they didn't tell you the mechanism for how you do this. It isn't just like talking with your parents or clashing narratives. It isn't just those types of things. It is uniquely the things that we tell you. It is the subtlety that exists when you sit down with your parents, when it is the words that aren't said, when it is the types of things, when it is them comforting you when you come home from your first breakup, without giving you a huge, long speech about what you should have done, but rather say, hey, that happens, your first relationship can be rough. These are the types of things. It is a subtlety that is actually how these things operate. We are the most nuanced team with the most charitable characteristics around. Very proud to oppose.